The bright morning sun streamed through the airport windows as Anthony stepped into the boarding area, pulling his carry-on suitcase behind him. He straightened his navy blue suit jacket and checked his ticket one more time. First class, seat 3A. He'd worked hard for this moment, his first international business trip as a senior marketing executive. This conference could change everything, he thought, adjusting his tie. After 10 years of climbing the corporate ladder, missing family dinners, and working weekends, he was finally getting the recognition he deserved. The gate agent called for first-class boarding. Anthony joined the line, noticing he was the only black person among the business travelers waiting to board. He was used to this, the sidelong glances, the subtle double takes, but he never let it bother him. His grandmother always said, "Your work speaks louder than their whispers." As he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, he received a warm smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir." Anthony nodded politely and walked down the jet bridge. The familiar smell of airplane cabin greeted him as he stepped on board. A flight attendant with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun stood at the entrance. "Welcome aboard," she said to the passenger in front of Anthony, a smile bright and welcoming. When it was Anthony's turn, her smile faded. "Boarding pass," she said flatly, extending her hand without making eye contact. Anthony handed it over. "Good morning." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Ms. Reynolds, examined his ticket with unusual scrutiny, flipping it over and squinting at the details. "Is something wrong?" Anthony asked. "Just making sure everything's in order," she replied, her tone suddenly professional but cold. "That's seat 3A." She pointed down the aisle without returning his greeting. Anthony made his way to his seat, stored his luggage in the overhead bin, and settled into the comfortable first-class seat. He took out his phone to send a quick text to his wife. "On the plane. Love you." As other first-class passengers boarded, Anthony noticed Ms. Reynolds greeting them warmly, offering to hang up their jackets and bringing pre-flight drinks without being asked. 20 minutes passed, and while everyone around him sipped orange juice or sparkling water, Anthony's tray table remained empty. He raised his hand politely. "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" Ms. Reynolds glanced at him and nodded curtly. In a moment, she served 2 more passengers who had boarded after him before finally approaching. "You needed something?" she asked, her voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Just some water, please," Anthony said with a patient smile. "May I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, frowning slightly. Anthony's stomach tightened, but he reached for his ticket in the seat pocket. "Is there a problem?" The flight attendant took the boarding pass, studying it again with exaggerated concern. The businessman across the aisle watched the interaction with mild curiosity. "I need to check something with the gate," Ms. Reynolds said, walking away with his ticket. Anthony sat quietly, aware of the subtle glances from other passengers. 5 minutes later, Ms. Reynolds returned with the head flight attendant, a tall man with gray temples. "Sir," the man said quietly, leaning down, "there seems to be a seating issue. We've had a computer error with our first-class bookings." Anthony's brow furrowed. "I booked this seat 3 months ago." "I understand, but we need to reseat you," Ms. Reynolds interjected. "We have a space available in economy." Before Anthony could respond, a white passenger who had been waiting by the cabin door was escorted to the empty seat beside him. "This gentleman is a platinum member who was on standby for an upgrade," Ms. Reynolds explained, not quite meeting Anthony's eyes. The head flight attendant at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We apologize for the inconvenience. We'll make a note of this for your next flight." Anthony knew what was happening. He'd faced this before, being the first one suspected when something went wrong. But making a scene wouldn't help. Not here, not now. "I understand," he said quietly, gathering his belongings. As he moved toward economy class, passing rows of curious eyes, he made a silent promise to himself. This wouldn't be the end of the story. Anthony squeezed into the narrow middle seat in row 32, his knees pressing against the seat in front of him. The businessman on his left barely looked up from his laptop, while the elderly woman on his right offered a sympathetic smile before returning to her book. "Can I help you store that?" a different flight attendant asked, pointing to Anthony's briefcase. "I've got it, thanks," he replied, shoving it under the seat and feeling the expensive leather compress against the dirty floor. The briefcase had been a gift from his wife to celebrate his promotion. "You're moving up in the world," she had said. Some moving up this was. The plane rumbled down the runway and lifted into the air. Anthony closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him: anger, embarrassment, and a familiar wariness that came with these situations. He'd faced discrimination before, but somehow being publicly moved from first class to economy felt especially humiliating. Everyone had seen it. Everyone knew. He pulled out his phone and switched it to airplane mode, then opened his notes app. His grandfather used to say, "Don't get mad, get evidence." Anthony began typing details: flight number, time, Ms. Reynolds' full name from her badge, descriptions of other staff members, and exactly what had been said. He'd learned long ago that specific details mattered when reporting incidents. Vague complaints got vague responses. An hour into the flight, the beverage cart reached his row. A young flight attendant named Chen offered drinks. When Anthony asked for tomato juice, Chen smiled and handed him the entire can, a small kindness that made his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," Anthony said quietly. "No problem, sir. Can I get you anything else?" Before Anthony could answer, Ms. Reynolds appeared behind Chen. "I'll take over here," she said briskly. Chen nodded and moved to the other aisle. Ms. Reynolds looked down at Anthony. "Comfortable?" she asked, her tone suggesting she couldn't care less about the answer. "I'd like to speak with the head flight attendant," Anthony said calmly. "He's busy with our premium passengers," she replied, emphasizing the word premium just enough to make her point. "I can take a message." Anthony met her gaze steadily. "I'll wait until he's available. I'd like to discuss what happened during boarding." Something flickered in Ms. Reynolds' eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or worry. "As I explained, there was a computer error with—" "I'd still like to speak with him directly," Anthony interrupted, keeping his voice level but firm. Ms. Reynolds pressed her lips together. "I'll let him know," she said before pushing the cart forward without offering Anthony the snack that other passengers were receiving. Anthony returned to his notes, adding this latest interaction. As he typed, a memory surfaced. He'd seen Ms. Reynolds somewhere before, but where? In his line of work, he met hundreds of people at conferences and business meetings. She seemed vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place her. The elderly woman beside him shifted in her seat. "That wasn't right, what they did to you," she whispered, her eyes still on her book. Anthony glanced at her, surprised. "Thank you for saying that." She nodded once. "My husband was a civil rights lawyer for 40 years. I recognize injustice when I see it." Anthony smiled slightly. "My grandfather marched in Selma." "Then you know what he would tell you to do," she said, finally looking up from her page. "Stand my ground." "Pick your battlefield," she corrected. "Sometimes the best fights aren't fought in the moment, but carefully with strategy." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. The woman returned to her book and he to his notes. As the plane soared over the Atlantic, he scrolled through his phone, looking at emails and company newsletters from the past few months. Something was nagging at his memory about Ms. Reynolds. And then he found it. His thumb froze over a particular image. It was from a corporate newsletter for Global Air's parent company, the very company where Anthony secretly served as a board member. And there, receiving an Employee of the Month award, was Ms. Reynolds. Anthony slowly lowered his phone, a plan beginning to form in his mind. He wasn't just any passenger she had discriminated against. He was someone who could actually do something about it, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his position. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, the hints of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes life handed you the perfect opportunity for change. Anthony's heart beat faster as he stared at the newsletter photo on his phone. There was no doubt about it. Ms. Reynolds was smiling proudly in the Global Air corporate bulletin from just 2 months ago. The caption read, "Flight Attendant Nancy Reynolds receives outstanding service recognition for 10 years with Global Air," the same company where Anthony quietly served on the board of directors. He zoomed in on the photo, studying her face. In the picture, she looked friendly and professional, nothing like the cold, dismissive woman who had humiliated him less than 2 hours ago. How could someone who received an award for customer service treat a passenger so poorly? Anthony hadn't mentioned his board position when booking his ticket. In fact, he deliberately kept his connection to the company private. The CEO had suggested this approach 6 months ago when the board wanted honest feedback about customer experience. Travel like a regular passenger, the CEO had said. See how our frontline staff treats people when they don't know they're being watched. That's the real test of our service. Anthony had agreed, thinking it was a smart business strategy. He never imagined he'd become the subject of such a revealing test case. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to ding on. Anthony buckled up and put his phone away, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just about him anymore. If Ms. Reynolds treated him this way, a man in a business suit with a first-class ticket, how might she treat others she deemed less important? The elderly woman beside him gripped the armrest during the bumpy air. Anthony instinctively offered his hand, and she took it with a grateful squeeze. I hate turbulence, she admitted. Been flying for 60 years and never got used to it. My first flight was when I was 10, Anthony said, trying to distract her. My uncle was a pilot. He let me sit in the cockpit before all the security rules changed. She smiled, her grip loosening slightly. I'm Grace, by the way. Anthony. Nice to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. The plane steadied and Grace released his hand. So she said quietly, what are you going to do about what happened? Anthony raised an eyebrow. What makes you think I'm going to do anything? Grace chuckled. The way you've been taking notes and that look on your face. I recognize it. My husband had the same expression when he was building a case. Anthony smiled despite himself. To be honest, I'm just figuring that out. But I think I have some influence that might help make changes. Good, Grace nodded firmly. Changes are needed. Just then, Ms. Reynolds passed by their row. Her eyes briefly met Anthony's, and he saw a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps. Had she realized who he was? No, that wasn't possible. His board position was confidential, known only to top executives. His name wouldn't trigger any alarms for a flight attendant. The beverage cart came around again, this time with a different attendant, a middle-aged man named Lewis according to his name tag. He offered Anthony and Grace drinks with genuine warmth. Excuse me, Anthony said after getting his drink. Is the head flight attendant available? I wanted to speak with him about something. Mr. Peterson is handling first class right now, Lewis replied. But I can let him know you'd like to speak with him. I would appreciate that, thank you. As Lewis moved on, Anthony noticed Ms. Reynolds at the front of the economy cabin, watching their interaction. She quickly turned away when she saw him looking. She's worried now, Grace observed quietly. Why do you say that? She's checking on you, wondering if you're making trouble. Grace took a sip of her tea. People who abuse their little bits of power always get nervous when they think they might be held accountable. Anthony nodded thoughtfully. He pulled out his phone again and opened his email. He had a decision to make. Fire off an angry complaint right now, demand immediate action, and possibly get Ms. Reynolds fired, or take a more measured approach that might lead to real change. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What would accomplish more? A quick punishment or a lasting transformation? Anthony thought about all the people who had faced similar treatment but lacked the power to do anything about it. He thought about the younger employees watching Ms. Reynolds and learning from her example. He thought about Grace's husband who had fought for civil rights for 40 years. Quick revenge might feel good, but Anthony was beginning to see a bigger opportunity, a chance to transform an entire company culture from the inside out. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, pulling Anthony from his thoughts. Throughout the remainder of the flight, he'd been quietly planning, writing notes on his phone between short conversations with Grace. The head flight attendant never did come to speak with him, despite Lewis's promise to pass along the message. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Local time is 8:45 a.m., and the temperature is a cool 12 degrees Celsius. Anthony gathered his belongings as passengers around him reached for overhead bins and turned on their phones. He noticed Ms. Reynolds at the front of the cabin, her professional smile back in place as she prepared to bid farewell to the passengers. Good luck with whatever you decide, Grace said, handing him a small piece of paper. That's my email. I'd like to know how this turns out. Anthony tucked the paper into his wallet with a grateful nod. "Thank you for your company, Grace. It made a difficult situation better." As they filed off the plane, Anthony made a point of stopping in front of Ms. Reynolds, who was standing at the exit door. "Thank you for the flight," he said pleasantly, making direct eye contact. Her smile faltered. "Have a nice day, sir," she replied, clearly uncomfortable with his friendly demeanor after what had happened. In the terminal, Anthony bypassed the usual taxi line and headed straight for the customer service desk of Global Air. A young woman with bright eyes looked up as he approached. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" she asked. "I'd like the names of all the flight staff on Flight GA 237 from New York, please. I want to put in a commendation for one of the attendants." It wasn't entirely a lie. Lewis and Chen had been kind, but Anthony needed official documentation of the crew. The representative seemed pleased. "Of course, sir. I can print that information for you." Anthony checked his watch after receiving the paperwork. His first meeting wasn't until tomorrow morning, a schedule he'd arranged specifically to allow time to recover from jet lag. Now, that free time would serve another purpose. He found a quiet coffee shop in the terminal and ordered a strong black coffee. The caffeine would help him think clearly despite the overnight flight. He pulled out his phone and called his assistant back in New York. "Morning, Diane," he said when she answered. "I need you to reschedule a few things." "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern in her voice. "Yes and no. Remember that quality assessment project for Global Air that the CEO asked me to undertake? The Undercover Customer Experience Evaluation. That's the one. Well, I've got some findings that need immediate attention. Can you clear my calendar for the next 3 days except for the Johnson conference? And I need you to quietly arrange a meeting with Priya from HR and David from the Diversity Office." "Of course," Diane said. "Should I tell them what it's about?" "Just say I need their expertise on a sensitive company matter, and Diane, keep this between us for now." After ending the call, Anthony sipped his coffee and opened his laptop. He began drafting a detailed document of everything that had happened on the flight, careful to stick to facts rather than emotions. Times, names, exact quotations. Then he started a second document, not a complaint, but a proposal. He'd seen enough corporate reactions to know how this typically played out. The company would apologize, maybe offer him some flight vouchers, possibly even discipline Ms. Reynolds, and nothing would really change. But Anthony was in a unique position to demand more than token gestures. As he typed, his plan took shape: mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, anonymous testing of service quality, new protocols for handling seating disputes, and most importantly, a complete overhaul of how discrimination complaints were tracked and addressed. His phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Meeting set with Priya and David for tomorrow at 10 a.m. London time at your hotel. They're bringing data you requested." Anthony smiled. Good. He needed hard numbers to back up his proposal: how many similar complaints had been filed, what patterns existed, what current training protocols were in place. A family walked past his table, the parents wearily herding excited children. Anthony watched them, reminded of why this mattered. It wasn't just about him or Ms. Reynolds. It was about changing a system that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place. He saved his documents, closed his laptop, and finished his coffee. Tomorrow would be a busy day. 2 weeks later, Anthony sat quietly at the end of a long mahogany table in Global Air's London headquarters. The quarterly board meeting was underway, with executives presenting colorful slides packed with impressive numbers. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the room. "Customer satisfaction is at an all-time high," boasted Walter, the head of operations, pointing to a chart with a steadily rising line. "Our first-class service in particular has received outstanding feedback." Anthony took a sip of water, hiding his expression behind the glass. During the past 2 weeks, he had worked tirelessly with Priya from HR and David from the Diversity Office. Together, they had compiled a detailed report that told a very different story than Walter's rosy presentation. "Any questions before we move on?" the CEO asked, looking around the table. "Actually," Anthony said, speaking up for the first time that morning, "I have some additional data on customer experience that might be relevant." The CEO nodded. Of course, Anthony. The floor is yours. Anthony stood and connected his laptop to the projector. The room darkened as he pulled up his presentation. He could feel curious eyes on him. It was unusual for him to bring up unscheduled business. 2 weeks ago, he began, his voice calm but firm, I experienced something on one of our flights that I believe warrants the board's attention. He described what had happened with Ms. Reynolds, sticking to facts and times, his tone professional rather than accusatory. As he spoke, he noticed several executives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Now, you might think this was just one bad experience, Anthony continued, clicking to the next slide. But when I worked with our HR team to analyze customer complaints from the past year, we found something concerning. The screen displayed a chart showing complaint categories. One bar, labeled Unexplained Seating Changes, stood much taller than the others. 127 passengers reported being moved from their assigned seats last year despite having valid tickets. When we looked at the demographics, he clicked again and the bar broke into colored segments. 89 of those passengers were people of color. A heavy silence fell over the room. The CEO leaned forward, his brow furrowed. This is troubling, Anthony. Why wasn't this brought to our attention before? Because our current system categorizes these as seating disputes, not potential discrimination cases, Anthony explained. They never reach this level of review. He clicked through more slides, showing patterns in customer feedback that had been buried in the data. With each new chart, the executive's expressions grew more concerned. Walter, who had been so proud of his customer satisfaction numbers, looked pale. I had no idea, he said quietly. I believe you, Anthony replied. That's part of the problem. We don't have systems in place to identify these patterns. The VP of Customer Relations raised her hand. What do you suggest, Anthony? Disciplinary action for the staff involved. Anthony shook his head. Firing one flight attendant won't solve a systemic problem. He pulled up a final slide titled Proposed Solutions. I've drafted a comprehensive plan, he explained. It includes mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, anonymous testing of service quality, and new protocols for tracking and addressing discrimination complaints. He handed out printed copies of his proposal. I'd also suggest we create a new position, a Chief Inclusion Officer who reports directly to the board. The CEO studied the document, nodding slowly. This is quite thorough. There's one more thing, Anthony said, his voice softening. I don't want this to be about punishing individuals. I want it to be about changing our culture. He described his idea for a pilot program where employees with documented bias issues would undergo intensive training and community service with diverse populations rather than simply being terminated. People can change if given the right tools and motivation, he said, and we should be the company that leads by example. As Anthony finished speaking, he looked around the table. Some executives appeared thoughtful, others uncomfortable, but all were clearly paying attention. The CEO stood up. I think we need to take this very seriously. Anthony, would you be willing to lead a task force to implement these recommendations? Anthony nodded, feeling a weight lift. 2 weeks later, Anthony sat quietly at the end of a long mahogany table in Global Air's London headquarters. The quarterly board meeting was underway, with executives presenting colorful slides packed with impressive numbers. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Customer satisfaction is at an all-time high, boasted Walter, the head of operations, pointing to a chart with a steadily rising line. Our first-class service in particular has received outstanding feedback. Anthony took a sip of water, hiding his expression behind the glass. During the past 2 weeks, he had worked tirelessly with Prina from HR and David from the Diversity Office. Together, they had compiled a detailed report that told a very different story than Walter's rosy presentation. Any questions before we move on? The CEO asked, looking around the table. Actually, Anthony said, speaking up for the first time that morning, I have some additional data on customer experience that might be relevant. The CEO nodded. Of course, Anthony. The floor is yours. Anthony stood and connected his laptop to the projector. The room darkened as he pulled up his presentation. He could feel curious eyes on him. It was unusual for him to bring up unscheduled business. 2 weeks ago, he began, his voice calm but firm, I experienced something on one of our flights that I believe warrants the board's attention. He described what had happened with Ms. Reynolds, sticking to facts and times, his tone professional rather than accusatory. As he spoke, he noticed several executives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Now, you might think this was just one bad experience, Anthony continued, flicking to the next slide. But when I worked with our HR team to analyze customer complaints from the past year, we found something concerning. The screen displayed a chart showing complaint categories. One bar, labeled Unexplained Seating Changes, stood much taller than the others. 127 passengers reported being moved from their assigned seats last year, despite having valid tickets. When we looked at the demographics, he clicked again, and the bar broke into colored segments. 89 of those passengers were people of color. A heavy silence fell over the room. The CEO leaned forward, his brow furrowed. This is troubling, Anthony. Why wasn't this brought to our attention before? Because our current system categorizes these as seating disputes, not potential discrimination cases, Anthony explained. They never reached this level of review. He clicked through more slides, showing patterns in customer feedback that had been buried in the data. With each new chart, the executive's expressions grew more concerned. Walter, who had been so proud of his customer satisfaction numbers, looked pale. I had no idea, he said quietly. I believe you, Anthony replied. That's part of the problem. We don't have systems in place to identify these patterns. The VP of Customer Relations raised her hand. What do you suggest, Anthony? Disciplinary action for the staff involved? Anthony shook his head. Firing one flight attendant won't solve a systemic problem. He pulled up a final slide titled Proposed Solutions. I've drafted a comprehensive plan, he explained. It includes mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff, anonymous testing of service quality, and new protocols for tracking and addressing discrimination complaints. He handed out printed copies of his proposal. I'd also suggest we create a new position, a Chief Inclusion Officer who reports directly to the board. The CEO studied the document, nodding slowly. This is quite thorough. There's one more thing, Anthony said, his voice softening. I don't want this to be about punishing individuals. I want it to be about changing our culture. He described his idea for a pilot program where employees with documented bias issues would undergo intensive training and community service with diverse populations rather than simply being terminated. People can change if given the right tools and motivation, he said, and we should be the company that leads by example. As Anthony finished speaking, he looked around the table. Some executives appeared thoughtful, others uncomfortable, but all were clearly paying attention. The CEO stood up. I think we need to take this very seriously. Anthony, would you be willing to lead a task force to implement these recommendations? Anthony nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. This was exactly what he had hoped for, not revenge, but a chance to create real change. On his shoulders. This was exactly what he had hoped for, not revenge, but a chance to create real change. The next 3 months flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Anthony's task force transformed from an idea into reality, with offices on the top floor of Global Air's headquarters. Every morning he arrived early, often before sunrise, determined to make the most of this opportunity. Morning Boss called Priya as Anthony walked in, juggling a tray of coffee cups and his briefcase. She had become his right hand in this project, bringing years of HR experience and genuine passion for creating a fair workplace. I told you not to call me that, Anthony replied with a grin, handing her a cup. Any word from the training department? Priya nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. The first module is ready for testing. 20 flight attendants will go through it next week. The training program had been one of the most challenging parts to develop. They needed something that would actually change behavior, not just tick a box for compliance. After weeks of research, they had designed interactive workshops focusing on real-world scenarios with actors from diverse backgrounds playing passengers. And the tracking system? Anthony asked, setting down his briefcase. David's team finished the beta version yesterday. We can start monitoring complaint patterns in real time now. Anthony smiled. This was moving faster than he had expected. The CEO had given them full support and resources, making it clear that this initiative was a top priority for the company. His phone buzzed with a text from the HR director. "She's here. Meeting room 3. Anthony took a deep breath. This would be the most difficult conversation of the day. In meeting room 3, Nancy Reynolds sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as Anthony entered, confusion crossing her face as she recognized him. You were on my flight," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Anthony replied, taking the seat across from her. "I was in seat 3A before being moved to economy." Nancy's face paled. "You're on the board of directors." "I am." Anthony placed a folder on the table between them. "Ms. Reynolds, do you know why you're here today?" She swallowed hard. "To be fired, I assume." "Actually, no." Anthony opened the folder. "I'm here to offer you a choice." He explained the new program they had developed, 6 months of intensive training and community service working with diverse populations, followed by a position as a peer trainer for other staff if completed successfully. "This isn't punishment," Anthony clarified. "It's an opportunity to be part of the solution." Nancy stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you give me a second chance? After what I did?" "Because firing you doesn't solve the bigger problem," Anthony said simply. "And because I believe people can change when they understand the impact of their actions." He slid a document across the table. "This is your choice. You can take the standard disciplinary route, which would likely end with termination, or you can join our pilot program." Nancy looked down at the paper, then back at Anthony. "Why are you doing this?" "When I was moved to economy, I met an elderly woman named Grace," Anthony said. "Her husband was a civil rights lawyer for 40 years. She told me that real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from transforming systems and helping people see differently." He stood up. "Take the day to think about it. Let HR know your decision tomorrow." As Anthony walked back to his office, he felt lighter somehow. 6 months ago, if someone had told him he'd be offering an opportunity to a flight attendant who had discriminated against him, he would have laughed in disbelief. Later that afternoon, as he reviewed the latest drafts of the training materials with his team, his assistant poked her head in. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "And Ms. Reynolds." Nancy stood in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. "I've made my decision," she said. "I'd want to be part of the program." Anthony nodded, feeling a quiet sense of victory that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with progress. "Welcome to the team," he said, extending his hand. 1 year later, Anthony stood at the podium in Global Air's main conference hall, looking out at hundreds of faces. The company had gathered for its annual leadership summit, but this year was different. This year, they had something special to celebrate. "When we started this journey 12 months ago," Anthony said into the microphone, "many people told me we were being too ambitious. They said changing a company culture takes years, not months." He smiled, remembering those early days, the late nights, the pushback from middle management, the skepticism from longtime employees. "But today, I'm proud to announce that customer complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped by 78% across all our flights." Applause rippled through the audience. Anthony spotted Pryor and David in the front row, beaming with pride. They had earned it. The 3 of them had worked tirelessly, often 7 days a week, to develop and implement what was now being called the Anthony Protocol. More importantly, Anthony continued, "Our employee satisfaction scores have increased by 23%. It turns out that when people feel equipped to handle difficult situations fairly, they're happier at work." Who would have thought? Light laughter spread through the crowd. The CEO nodded encouragingly from his seat on the stage. "But numbers only tell part of the story," Anthony said, his tone growing more serious. "The real success lies in the individual transformations I've witnessed over the past year." He gestured toward the side of the stage. "I'd like to invite someone special to share her experience with you." Nancy Reynolds walked confidently to the podium. She looked different now, not just her new uniform as a training specialist, but something in her eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you, Anthony," she said, adjusting the microphone. "A year ago, I was the problem, not the solution." She spoke honestly about her journey, the defensive anger she'd felt at first, the uncomfortable realizations during training, and finally, the transformative experience of working with diverse communities. I had never examined my own biases, Nancy admitted. I made snap judgments about people based on their appearance, and I used my small position of power to make some passengers feel unwelcome. She took a deep breath. Working with the community service program changed everything. I spent 6 months helping refugee families navigate air travel, people who had never been on a plane before, who didn't speak English, who were terrified of what awaited them in a new country. Her voice cracked slightly. They taught me more about courage and dignity than I could ever teach them about flying. Anthony watched from the side, remembering his original anger on that flight. How distant it seemed now, replaced by something far more satisfying, real, measurable change. After Nancy finished speaking, the CEO took the stage to make a major announcement. Global Air was establishing a permanent inclusion officer position, reporting directly to the board, and they were implementing the Anthony Protocol across all their international operations. What began as one unfortunate incident has become the catalyst for transforming our entire company, the CEO said. And other airlines are taking notice. Indeed they were. 3 major competing airlines had already reached out to Anthony about implementing similar programs. What had started as one man's response to discrimination was becoming an industry-wide movement. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, Anthony felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Nancy holding a small envelope. "This came for you," she said, from someone named Grace. Anthony opened the envelope and found a short note. "My husband would have been proud. Real change comes from wisdom, not anger. Thank you for showing the way." He smiled, tucking the note into his pocket. Outside the conference hall windows, a plane took off, climbing steadily into the blue sky. Anthony watched it rise, carrying hundreds of passengers who would never know how their journey had been made better because one man chose transformation over revenge. That, he thought, was the most powerful victory of all.